Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a topic that's both fascinating and a little bit, disturbing.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the history of punishment,
Right.
specifically the disappearance of public torture.
Fascinating stuff.
Now, I know you're thinking, public executions, torture. That's like medieval times, right?
Yeah, you would think, but
But that's not the whole story. We're going to be looking at excerpts from a book called Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. It's by this guy, Michel Foucault.
oh yeah,
And honestly, it's a classic for a reason.
definitely a classic.
It really makes you think. So can you picture it? Huge crowds of people gathering to watch criminals being tortured and executed.
It's hard to imagine, right?
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Public executions were once this massive spectacle, almost like entertainment.
Kind of.
So the big question is, why did this practice disappear? What happened?
That's a great question, and it's something that Foucault really digs into.
I mean, it's interesting because, like I said, we tend to think of public executions and torture as something from the Dark Ages.
Yeah, something barbaric
And-
from the past.
Exactly. But they were still very much a part of the justice system in the 18th century,
It's true.
which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So to really get into this, Foucault starts with a truly horrific example.
Okay.
The execution of this guy, Robert François Damiens, in 1757. So this Damiens guy, he tried to assassinate King Louis XV of France.
Oh wow.
And his punishment was... extreme is an understatement.
Yeah, to put it lightly.
Foucault describes it all in gruesome detail. Red-hot pincers, molten lead,
Oh my God.
being drawn and quartered. I mean, it was designed to be a spectacle, like a really graphic public display of the sovereign's power, the king.
Yeah, it's meant to send a message.
It's just unimaginable.
Mhm.
So it wasn't just about being cruel, right? It was like a calculated performance. That's pretty chilling when you think about it.
It really is, and that's what Foucault argues.
So what you're saying is,
Public torture. It serves several purposes.
okay,
It reinforced the power of the sovereign.
by showing everyone what happens if you disobey.
Right. It was meant to mark the victim with infamy. Make an example of them for all to see.
Yeah, like a warning to anyone who might even think about stepping out of line.
Precisely. But it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
Foucault argues that public torture was also about reactivating power.
Reactivating power? What does that even mean?
He suggests that each act of punishment was a way for the sovereign to kind of reassert their dominance, their control over the population.
So every time they punished someone publicly
It was a reminder.
of who was in control.
Exactly. Like, look at what happens to those who disobey. It's not just about punishing the individual. It's about sending a message.
To the entire community.
Right. And the message wasn't just about fear.
It's also about the truth.
Yeah, the truth of the crime. And the justice is being meted out. The spectacle of public torture was meant to demonstrate the absolute power of the sovereign, to define right and wrong, and to enforce their will. But here's where things get really interesting. The 18th century was also the time of the Enlightenment.
Right. All that emphasis on reason and individual rights.
Exactly.
So did those ideas have any impact on views of punishment at the time?
That's a great point. It seems like those two things, public torture and the Enlightenment, wouldn't really go together.
Yeah, it feels like they'd be at odds.
You're right, and that tension played a huge role in the shift away from public torture. Enlightenment thinkers started to criticize these public executions as barbaric and ineffective.
They were like, hey, this isn't really working.
Yeah, and they argued that punishment shouldn't be about revenge.
Or spectacle.
Right, it should be about reform and rehabilitation.
So the focus shifted from making the criminal suffer to changing their behavior.
That's a great way to put it. There was this new emphasis on the humanity of the criminal. The idea that even someone who did something awful was still a human being capable of redemption.
Wow, that's a huge shift in thinking. It makes you wonder how those new ideas actually played out. Did they lead to more humane forms of punishment, or did they just create new systems of control?
That's a question Foucault grapples with throughout his work, and it leads us to the rise of the prison.
Okay, so if public torture was supposed to be this big, scary spectacle, how did we end up with prisons? I mean, that seems like a pretty big change.
It is a big change, and it didn't happen overnight. What's interesting is that the prison, well, it wasn't really seen as a major form of punishment at first.
Really?
Yeah, it was mainly used to hold people before their trial or for short sentences. The whole idea of using long-term imprisonment to, reform criminals, That was a pretty new concept.
So why did the prison ultimately become the main form of punishment? I mean, it's not exactly known for being, a nice place.
That's a good point. And it is something that a lot of people find surprising. There were a few different factors, but a big one was the economy. The economy was changing.
Yeah.
Societies were becoming more industrialized and urbanized, and there was a growing need for a workforce that was disciplined, obedient, and productive.
So you're saying that the prison, with its emphasis on work and order, was seen as a way to kind of mold people into the ideal workers
Mhm.
for this new economic reality.
Exactly. It was a way to control and manage the population, shaping them into the kind of people needed for this new industrial society.
Hmm.
And at the same time, there was this rising concern about crime and social disorder, especially in these rapidly growing cities. Public executions, even though they were supposed to deter crime, were becoming increasingly chaotic, unpredictable. you
Yeah,
know.
like the crowds could get out of hand.
Right. They could turn against the authorities. It created a spectacle that kind of undermined the whole point of the sovereign's authority.
Okay, that makes sense. So the prison, with its controlled environment and constant surveillance, it offered a much more efficient and predictable way to manage crime.
Exactly. Authorities could remove what they saw as undesirable elements from society, but they could also hold out this possibility of reforming them, turning them into productive members of the workforce.
So the intention, at least in the beginning, was to rehabilitate criminals.
Right.
But then, how did the prison become such a brutal and dehumanizing place? That doesn't sound very rehabilitative.
That's the big question, isn't it? One factor was that early prisons were often overcrowded and poorly managed.
Makes sense.
But Foucault digs deeper. He argues that there's something more fundamental going on. The very architecture and design of prisons, with the isolation cells, the constant surveillance, the rigid routines, he says that was inherently dehumanizing.
So even with good intentions, the prison was almost set up to fail from the start.
It's a good point. That emphasis on control and discipline, while maybe well-intentioned, ultimately led to a system that was more about punishment than rehabilitation. And this brings us back to Foucault's concept of the delinquent. He argues that prisons don't just punish crimes.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they actually create criminals.
Hold on, you're saying that prisons might actually be making crime worse? How does that even work?
It's a pretty radical idea, right?
Hmm.
But his point is that by classifying, categorizing, and constantly observing people, the prison system creates this identity of the delinquent. It defines people by their past actions, their perceived potential for future transgressions, and their place in the prison hierarchy.
So if you're constantly told you're a criminal,
Exactly.
you're more likely to become one.
That's a great way to put it. And this is one of Foucault's most compelling arguments. The prison, in trying to control and reform, might actually be perpetuating the very problem it's meant to solve.
Wow, that's heavy. So if the prison is so problematic, what are the alternatives? Did Foucault offer any solutions?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Foucault doesn't really offer any easy answers. His focus is more on analyzing how power works, how systems of control are created and maintained. But his work does raise these really important questions about how we think about crime and punishment and justice. It makes you question whether the systems we have are truly effective, or if they're just making things worse.
I'm starting to see why this book is considered a classic. It really challenges our assumptions about things we take for granted.
Right.
Like, we just assume that prisons are a necessary part of society, but Foucault really makes you question that.
Exactly. And it's not just about prisons either. His analysis of disciplinary power has implications for how we understand all sorts of institutions: schools, hospitals, factories, any institution that seeks to control and regulate human behavior.
So this raises a big question for me. We're still living with this legacy of the prison system and all its problems. So
Right.
where do we go from here? If Foucault doesn't give us any concrete solutions, where do we even start to look for alternatives?
Well, I think the first step is recognizing the problem. Foucault's work helps us understand how this system of control and discipline became so ingrained in our society. Once we see the problem clearly, we can start to imagine different ways of approaching crime and punishment.
It's like he's giving us a new way to see the world,
Yeah.
one that reveals these hidden mechanisms of power at work in our everyday lives.
That's a great way to put it. And once we start to see those mechanisms,
Yeah.
we can start to think about ways to resist them.
So it's not about getting rid of these systems altogether, but about becoming more aware of how they function and finding ways to, subvert or transform them.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these systems of power aren't static. They're constantly evolving, changing. So the challenge is to stay engaged, to keep asking questions, and to be open to new approaches.
That's a great point. The history of punishment shows us that systems of control can change. The question is, are we willing to imagine something different? Are we ready to move beyond a prison and create a system that truly promotes justice and rehabilitation?
That's the challenge for all of us. It requires us to think deeply about the kind of society we want and the values we want to uphold.
You know, it's really wild to think about how these systems of power, they really operate,
Mm.
and how they've shaped our world. Thinking back to those public torture spectacles, it's easy to see the shift to prisons as progress. But like we were talking about, things aren't always so simple.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that Foucault really helps us see how progress isn't always this straight line.
Yeah.
Sometimes what seems like a positive change can actually lead to new forms of control that are just as bad, maybe even worse, because they're harder to see.
Right, like we traded one form of control for another. So let's talk about how the prison, with all its flaws, became the go-to solution for crime. Foucault uses this phrase self-evident punishment when he talks about prisons. So how did that happen? How did we get to that point?
Well, it's important to remember the context, right? The reformers who were advocating for prisons back then in the 18th and 19th centuries,
Yeah.
they genuinely wanted to create a more humane system. They were horrified by the brutality of public executions.
Right, of course.
But in trying to move away from that, they ended up creating a system that in many ways just replicated those same power dynamics, just in a subtler, more hidden way.
Exactly, and that's like a key part of Foucault's argument, right?
It is. He's not saying that prisons are morally worse than public torture.
Okay.
His point is that they operate on a different logic, a logic of discipline and control that's often invisible.
And that logic, like we talked about earlier, it goes way beyond prisons.
Exactly. It's in schools, hospitals, factories, even our own homes.
We're all subject to those subtle forms of power.
Yeah.
And normalization. It's like, even when no one's explicitly forcing us to do anything, there's this pressure to behave a certain way. I can definitely relate to that.
No, absolutely. Think about how schools work, for example. Students are constantly being watched, evaluated, ranked. They learn to conform, not just because they're afraid of getting in trouble, but because they internalize those standards. It becomes part of who they are.
You know what? That reminds me of social media. We're always monitoring ourselves, comparing, judging, trying to fit in.
Absolutely. Social media is a perfect example of how disciplinary power works in the modern world. It's everywhere, but it's so subtle that we barely even notice it.
So then, where do we go from here? If these systems of control are so deeply embedded in everything, how can we even begin to change them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Foucault doesn't give us easy answers, but his work gives us a way to understand how power works and how it can be challenged.
So it's not about destroying these systems entirely, right? It's about becoming aware of how they work and finding ways to maybe subvert them or transform them into something better.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that power is fluid. It moves through society, and we're all a part of it in one way or another.
So it comes down to both individual and collective action. Like, we need to become more critical of the systems around us and work together to create alternatives.
I think that's the takeaway here. Foucault's work is a call to awareness. It challenges us to question the things we take for granted. It encourages us to look for those hidden mechanisms of power and to think creatively about how we can resist them and reshape them.
This has been a really incredible journey. We've gone from public torture to the inner workings of power in modern society. I know you, our listener, are out there thinking about these ideas with us.
I hope so. If we've piqued your interest and made you think critically about the world around you, then we've accomplished what we set out to do.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking exploration of power, punishment, and what it means to be human. Until next time, keep questioning and stay curious.